everyone. My name is Michelle Gomez, and I just want to take this time to thank the Latinas in Tech organization for inviting me back to be a speaker for this annual event. I truly am so appreciative of the continued partnership I've had with Latinas in Tech over the years, and I'm glad to be here to share yet another perspective on Latinidad and what it's like for Latinas to strive for their goals and what are some of the obstacles they have to overcome in this current world we live in. And if you followed me for a very long time or not, please know I was a career coach for a long while. And then about a year and a half ago, I pivoted my business to more spirituality as I've taken on a role as a curandera. And I am currently on the shamanic path from my Inca elders. And so what I bring to the table today is a collaboration of what I've seen in the corporate structure when it comes to being a Latina in business and in career, but also how this relates to the healing that we are doing as a collective of women through the generations and what we have to face. So I'm going to be sharing my screen here, and I'm going to show you a little bit of what I mean. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Latinx families and the taboo topic of mental health and vulnerability. Part of the reason why we might be struggling in life, or some of you be facing some obstacles that seem to be difficult to overcome, is because we come from a culture where much of the issues around our generational trauma, being vulnerable, being able to have open dialogue and discussions about the past, about the current realities that we're facing, can be difficult for Latino families. And it's not necessarily something you've created or something you can necessarily change on, at the drop of a dime, but this is generational, this is cultural, this is colonial in many ways. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit of what that's about. This presentation is a production of Healed Hijas, my community, and Michelle Gomez Coaching, which is my company. So a little introduction about me. My name is Michelle Gomez. I am the founder, CEO of Michelle Gomez Coaching. In the Healed Hijas community, I serve as a medicine woman and a curandera. And so what I do with Healed Hijas and Michelle Gomez Coaching is we create events, we create content to be able to help hijas at different stages of their healing journey. We reintroduce Indigenous practices of ceremony and ritual, and we do so in a way that allows the reclaiming Latina to be able to integrate her identity as a descendant of multiple generations of power and multiple generations of healing that occurs. And so that's a little bit about my business. I am a wife and mother of 2 daughters myself. I am of Ecuadorian and Mexican descent, first generation born here. I'm the first in my family to go to college, to graduate with a bachelor's and then pursue and graduate with a master's. I was the first in my family to become a published author and first corporate business owner. I have an LLC of my own, an S Corp. And so that's a little bit about me. And what I'm here to do is to share insight on how Latinx families and the discomfort with topics of mental health, vulnerability, and generational trauma tends to impact adult Latinas in their pursuit of empowered identities and self-confidence. See, a lot of the tools that we need to strive in our adult lives are tools that, unfortunately, many of us had to learn how to embody later on in life because we were taught at a certain point in our childhood that the things that we needed to embody in terms of self-confidence, being outspoken, being, questioning power, challenging status quos. These aren't things that weren't necessarily celebrated in our childhoods. In fact, we were taught to not embody those things, and we were taught to stay quiet. We were taught to just be grateful. We were taught to not rock the boat. And so I'm going to share a little bit of history on that and why it's so important to overcome that today. So why Latinx families struggle to have vulnerable and honest conversations about mental health. What I share here today is a collaborative qualitative research that I have done throughout the years, not only in my own healing journey, in healing in my mother wound, but also in helping so many other Latinas heal their mother wounds, the inner feminine wounds and generational cycles of trauma that we are trying to undo and unlearn today. And so these four pillars, out of the years of research and the years of work that I've done with my clients, these are the four that stand out to me the most. I'm sure there's plenty of others, but to keep this message simple and relatable, and most importantly, digestible, I wanted to break it down to just these four pillars. So the first pillar is that speaking about vulnerability and mental health is a sign of weakness. Many times our families are, they're very much like, keep us, sea chingona, no se deja, tú puedes, and sort of this idea that if we're not fighting, surviving, we're working hard, then we're weak. And to acknowledge emotions, to acknowledge mental health struggles, to acknowledge the vulnerability that we carry is a sign of weakness. And for many of our families who currently still live in survival mode, despite having a pretty good life here in the States, it's a struggle for them to really sit and have these conversations because there is fear and unsafety in appearing weak in this scenario. And so the idea that it's a sign of weakness tends to deter these conversations, or the person who tends to bring it up or wants to talk about it is ridiculed, chastised, made fun of. And so that's pillar number one. Pillar number two is that it is a sense of betrayal or disrespect. We are taught since we were little girls that our parents sacrificed for us. Our parents worked hard for us. Mira todo lo que tienes. A ti nunca te faltaba un plato de comer. Tú tienes un techo encima de la cabeza. Tú tienes una cama donde acostarte, ropa para ponerte, and sort of those fundamental needs being met by parents that worked hard to give it to us. Then anytime we have any questions or we have opinions about how we were raised and how that affected us, to a parent, it comes off as a sense of betrayal. It's a sense of disrespect. Like, don't question me about how I brought you up. Don't bring me your problems. Like, a ti nunca te faltaba nada, así que tú no tienes por qué quejarte, And so the parent struggles to really sit with an adult child and hear an adult child's opinions and experiences and be questioned about why they made certain parental decisions or what really happened in these scenarios, right? Because as children, we might remember things a certain way, but as we grow older, we want to know like the truth. We want to know what was that about. But to bring this stuff up is a sense of betrayal. And it could be with so many different issues, right? Even down to gender roles. Why was my brother allowed to have way more freedom than I was? Or why was I expected to serve the men in the home and the men weren't asked to do the same for us? Sort of that sense of ¿qué pasó? Like, what was that about? ¿Y por qué fueron las cosas así? That a parent struggles with sitting with that. It comes off as a sense of betrayal, disrespect. And so it keeps us not bringing these things up. Then we have unhealed generational trauma. Many times, the reason why our parents cannot sit with us and have these difficult conversations is because they are still deeply triggered and deeply wounded of their unhealed trauma from their childhoods and how their parent couldn't be there for them, to soothe them, to protect them, to guide them in a way that they needed. And so from their perspective, how could I give you what I didn't have? And it's very difficult to have conversations with parents that are still dealing with those triggers and still dealing with those wounds, because there becomes an issue where I've seen this happen so much with my clients, where we do this comparative suffering. This comparative suffering is, let's say, here's an example. You come to your parent and say, hey, I was really traumatized by this. I didn't appreciate that you made me do A, B, and C. I don't understand. I was very hurt by that, and your parent could say, you think that was bad? look at how we had it. And they could tell you about cómo les fue en el rancho y en el pueblo, cómo les fue, fuimos tan pobres, how they were disciplined and how, you didn't have to suffer through that. So you should be thankful. But all that really is comparative suffering. My suffering is way worse than yours. So your suffering is not necessary. It's not real. And it's nothing for you to be crying about. So this unhealed generational trauma, again, further makes it difficult for Latino families to sit and have honest conversations about vulnerability and mental health. And the fourth pillar is normalized narcissism and manipulation tactics. Unfortunately, because of the culture that we were raised in, very manipulative and narcissistic tendencies that particularly come from the mother are normalized, and they're almost made like it's not a big deal. Like, well, of course, that's what moms do. It's almost a joke at some point, but it really isn't. Terms like gaslighting, terms like invalidating your emotions, these are things that tend to occur and that tend to be normalized, right? And then they can be used to manipulate and control an adult child even now, because at the carnal base of any daughter is she doesn't want to shame or hurt her parents. She just wants to be able to have open and honest conversations about these things, because it will help her further integrate her childhood and further heal when she gets to hear perspectives from two adults. Now that she's an adult, she gets to look at situations through the lens of an adult daughter. But if we can't have those open conversations, a lot of times the trauma or the unanswered questions keep you in this infantile state. Now you feel like you're that little girl who doesn't have the right to ask questions or to challenge the situation, or doesn't have the right to ask for clarity. And so you're left to make up a story about what really happened. And that story could be further harmful to you. And so those are the four main pillars that I've noticed through my work. Now, one thing I do feel it's very, very important to talk about, the reason why all of these issues tend to come up is because much of our mothering, the way that our mothers parented us, the way that our parents parented us, was informed. Now, I'm going to say that word one more time. It was informed by systems of oppression and Latinx parenting styles. So what I mean by this is that just like how now we're in a generation where much of the way we are treating our children with this generation is informed because of things like gentle parenting, conscious parenting, autonomy, boundaries. Like, these are now ways that we are learning to raise our children. And so to us who are mothers and are parenting daughters now, we see the value in empowering them. We see the value in allowing them to have autonomy and practice boundaries of their personal space and their rooms and stuff, right? We understand about how gentle or conscious parenting means parenting from a place of mutual respect, and how that is valuable, because we want our children to grow up and be not only respectful of themselves, but respectful of others, right? And it's not a forced, tyrannical, like, you have to do it because I'm an adult and you're a child and you don't know any better, and this is how it's going to be throughout life. No, we're actually teaching a more conscious way of being a human being, right? But what if we were being fed other things, other ways about how to raise a good little girl? And so much of those systems of oppression that informed the way our mothers were told, this is how you raise a good girl, this is how you create a good woman, informed how she was taught to mother us. And these systems of oppression are now pillars of areas that we need to unlearn so that we can thrive today. So let's talk about it. Marianismo, patriarchy is what it is. Now, in Marianismo, women are to be controlled. We're expected to be nurturers, to just be grateful with what we can get, to always be humble and subservient. That was what Marianismo, patriarchy, taught mothers is what is required of women. And so if you were taught many of those things, that you couldn't trust your own judgment, you needed to ask permission, you needed to always be giving, doing for others, and that you weren't allowed to be proud of yourself, that is a system of oppression, belief system that was passed on to you. Capitalism. Now, with capitalism, we face things like racism, sexism, anti-immigration, and the importance of living in survival mode, like meaning always working, always doing, hoarding, getting more, obtaining more, achieving more. That's what capitalism does. And so the whole idea, many of you remember not being able to rest on a Saturday or Sunday, like levántate, ponte a barrer, ponte a limpiar, a ver hacer algo, that is a capitalistic mentality. And this is why many of us that are unlearning and healing now, learning how to rest is actually a life-changing transformation, right? Because that means we get to learn how to be a human being instead of a human doing all the time. But again, our mothers who we thought like, Mom, why can't you just let me rest? Again, she was taught this is how you create a good daughter. And so that capitalistic mentality contributed to what she instilled in you on what it means to be productive. Okay. Now, organized religion and purity culture. This is a big one as well, because it means that through these systems of oppression, no matter what faith your family practice, a lot of them are colonial. A lot of them are the conquistadores and their religion that they brought, their version of Christianity turned into Catholicism or vice versa. So whether your parents were practicing Catholics or Christians, much of the programming that was instilled on young girls early on was based in purity culture, meaning you had to be a virgin, and you had to be modest and cover yourself up and don't flaunt your body because you don't know who you're going to tempt, right? But having also this social expectation of one day you are to grow up and get married and have children because that is your duty. And so this really limits a daughter's ability to dream big and decide for herself what her life will be. Not every woman is destined to get married and have children. Not every woman wants to get married and have children, right? And purity and modesty in the form of control is not the same as being discreet or having discernment over yourself and who you share yourself with. Both are not mutually exclusive, but purity and modesty is a way that religion controlled young women, and let them feel like they needed to live up this expectation to be modest and be pure, instead of exploring their sensuality, exploring their sexuality, exploring their feminine power, really. And so through these systems of oppression, our mothering style, the ways we were mothered, were imprinted by a lot of this. And so if you were made to believe that you were innately dirty, that your period is wrong and it's a sin and it's a punishment, and that your sensuality or sexuality is dangerous and can't be trusted, this is part of ways that systems of oppression control women. And unfortunately, our mothers may not have known any better. And so they thought they were doing something good for you and by you by placing this programming within you. And finally, colonialism and immigration. Now, there's suppression of one's own culture and heritage that it comes to this. Usually, like with colonialism, you think about the stories and you hear about the history, the true history on how Turtle Island was taken over by the colonizer, and how they imposed their religion, they imposed their way of life on a community that had its own autonomy, that was a sovereign community. And so think about how that could be translated into the way that you were raised and the way that your parents navigated this United States coming from a different country. So basically suppression of your own culture and heritage in some ways, like remember who you are, remember where you come from, but also strive to achieve more so that you can take us with you. So there's a suppression of one's own culture and heritage in order to assimilate. But it's an assimilation that's unique because it doesn't necessarily mean you have access to resources, right? Your family may want you to, go to school, or, get the degree, do what you got to do to push the family forward. But it doesn't mean necessarily that they would have access to resources all the time, right? And so the colonialism is what it teaches is that the parents will tell the child, here's what you need to do, to take advantage of all these available resources, but that doesn't mean that they have access to those resources. So that puts added pressure on you, the daughter. And also minimal opportunities for original landowners. So again, a lot of those who come from Mexico The West belonged to Mexico. This was original Mexico's land when we were all Turtle Island before the colonizers separated us and put borders in. This was originally their land. And so being told that you are an illegal immigrant, that you don't belong here, that you don't have a right to be here, it further harms the immigrant that's coming here and trying to build a life, right? Because this feeling of, I don't belong here, I'm here illegally, I shouldn't be here. And at any time, I can be caught and sent back to my country, and that would be terrible, right? And so living in that fear, living in that survival, living in that trauma, and that trauma then reflecting in the way that our parents may have raised you, and some of the fears they might have instilled in you. This is how colonialism appears through the generations of parenting. And the threat of displacement, like I just said, contributing to a fear of asking for help. This is why we can't be vulnerable. This is why we can't talk about mental health, because we don't have that kind of time. We can't ask for help. We can't let people know that we're struggling, because if we ask for help and we are open with the fact that we are undocumented or whatnot, then we are in danger. So these are why these systems of oppression contribute to why we can't have open dialogue about mental health and vulnerability with many of our older generational parents. And I find this to be the most prevalent with baby boomers and older. I haven't seen much of this with Gen X parents. I fall into the Gen X parent demographic, but I noticed this specifically with baby boomers and older. So if your parents were in the baby boomer demographic, then this might seem most relevant to you. So Latinx families struggle to talk about mental health. We're going to go into each one specifically. So it's a sign of weakness. It brings shame to the family, takes focus away from surviving, and threatens community support. This is what I mean about shame. So many of our heritages, many of our cultures rely on community support. I believe that this is why enmeshment is a big deal in our culture. This is why everybody knows everyone's business, everyone's up in everyone's business. And it's because they need to feel like I'm good within the community, so that when I need help, when I need support, when I need an extra hand from that community, they will be willing to give it to me, because I've shown myself to be a good parent. I've shown myself to make good decisions, because look at my children, they are a reflection of me. So when the child grows up and now has questions and is challenging the way that they were raised, they don't want to talk about it, because they feel we can't talk about this, we can't acknowledge this, because now this threatens the community support that I may need later on in life if you bring this up. So just a little bit about that, which is a fancy way of saying los que dirán, right? ¿Qué va a decir la gente? And that shame, now those of us who are more empowered in our identity today, we could care less what people think. But back in prior generations, caring what people think meant survival. It meant no, I might need to ask for a loan. I may need to ask for help. I need to ask for assistance in some way, for support in some way, and so when that happens, they want to do it from a place of knowing that they are a pillar within their community, that they are revered in their community. Second one is it creates a sense of betrayal or disrespect, right? Cannot call out or question adults or parents. They view it as disrespect, but also why? Because there's a lack of emotional intelligence to support effective communication. Many of our older generational parents do not understand how to have conflict resolution. They don't have the communication style to be able to sit and dialogue about this stuff. And so they feel a sense of inadequacy, like, I don't know what I'm doing. And all they know is to lean towards more narcissistic and manipulative communication styles without even knowing. And we'll go into that a little bit later. But the sort of inability to know how to handle something makes it so that they would rather just avoid it, right? And of course, there's a lack of understanding of what's a conversation versus a confrontation. To them, if you just ask a question, if you just bring up something from the past to try to get some clarity, it's easily perceived as confrontational by mama y papa, right? So not being modeled how to have conflict resolution type of conversations makes them even more inequipped to handle whenever you have something you'd like to talk about. Unhealed generational trauma. Now, one of the things that unhealed generational trauma tends to reflect in a parent is apathy. Apathy means like they don't have empathy, like they struggle to see why this is so hard for you because they have been through worse. So that's how you know you've developed apathy. When it's like, well, I pulled myself out of the hole and I got through it. And my mom wasn't nearly as affectionate or aware as I was, and I turned out fine. So you should be fine. So that's what apathy sounds like. So it's difficult sometimes for a parent to sit with you and your discomfort and in your pain, because to them, they're already doing that trauma comparing that we talked about earlier. And that shows through as apathy. And there's also a little bit of jealousy and resentment there because you may have had the life they've always wanted. You get to live in the country that they wanted to live in, the house they wanted to have access to food and clothes and vacations or memory making, community that they didn't have, and so to them, what are you complaining about? Because there could be some underlying resentment and jealousy. Also, there's a prevalence of dysregulation of emotional trauma responses. So a lot of our parents who never healed, they may yell, they may shout, they may throw things, they may get just emotionally agitated, or they may succumb to their emotions. So they may start crying, they may start self-deprecating, oh, soy la peor madre del mundo, and that really hinders the conversation because their unhealed generational trauma has now made it so that they are not capable of regulating their emotions and they're unaware of their own trauma responses. The way that they fly off the handle or the way they react, their way that their tone of voice changes, their body language changes, the things that they say when they're in high stress mode because of the unhealed trauma, they're unaware of it. It's sort of like their brain goes into that place of you're not safe, you have to protect yourself by all costs. And at times it comes out very harmful. And so again, this is another reason why it's hard to sit in these conversations with you. And also unresolved trauma chapters. When a person doesn't heal their trauma or doesn't talk through their trauma, doesn't visit their trauma with the support of a therapist, counselor, a shaman, or a curandera of some sort, then the trauma sort of lives on. Here's what I mean. When you talk about it, when you process it and you unpack it all, your brain starts to create a start and an end time to when that happened. You can say, well, that happened when I was 8 years old, when I was visiting the state of blank, and I was at this house for this situation. And that's when the trauma occurred. And you get to put a start time and an end time to the trauma and only visit the trauma from a place of safety. Like you can go back and sort of unpack it further, but it's still happening. So when we don't talk about our trauma, when we don't deal or unpack with our trauma, it feels like it's still happening. It hasn't ended. And so this is why we're so reactive. This is why we're so afraid. This is why we self-protect and self-soothe in some harmful ways. And so not having those trauma chapters resolved through therapy, through healing practices, through work with a medicine woman or man, then it makes it so that that person's body, that person's brain doesn't understand that traumatic experience ended at a certain time. There's still this sense like it could still be happening. It's still happening. And I have to protect myself anytime I feel threatened. So these are just some of the ways that unhealed generational trauma can show up in the way that we were parented. And finally, normalized narcissism and manipulation tactics. Unfortunately, I'd have to say that in our culture, in Latinidad, these tactics come off as, they're joked of a lot, but it's not funny, really, So let's talk a little bit about maternal narcissism. Maternal narcissism is a form of parenting where the mother uses coercion to manipulate the outcomes, decisions, and actions of her children. So she'll threaten their safety by taking away love, becoming silent, threatening things. Or even just taking on this sort of sufrida, like, oh, woe is me, in an effort to not own up to what she's done or how she made other people feel, whether it was on purpose or not, right? They'll use guilt, shame, or threats in order to avoid the topic. In her effort to not have to answer your questions, in her effort to not have to fess up to anything or apologize, she may guilt, shame, or use threats. So things like, ay, ¿qué me quieres decir? Que soy la peor madre del mundo con todo lo que yo que sacrifiqué por ti y me vine de este país para darte una nueva vida y así es como me tratas. You know, there's that. There's shame. So you might hear like, you know, comparative, like, ay, mira la hija de ella, cómo la cuida, mira de ella cómo es de bien cercana a su mamá y cómo le compra cosas, y mira qué buena ella hasta cuando se casó no la dejó a su madre, ahí está, you know, again, shame and comparison and making you feel less than. And of course, the threats. You know, entonces no me hablas, entonces yo nunca te voy a hablar, you know, like threatening distance, or if your parents are helping you financially, threaten you financially, pues no te vamos a ayudar, mejor no cuentes con nosotros, si somos los peor padres del mundo, entonces no te vamos a ayudar, you know, threats to be kicked out, or, you know, just different ways that they could withhold love or assistance that they have given up to this point. And finally, there's enmeshment. This is a form of normalized narcissism and manipulation that is a little bit hard because, I mean, we're from our indigenous roots, lived in a matriarchal society of community, tribes, villages, spent a lot of time together to help take care of the land together, to help take care of each other's families together. They lived in harmony with one another, and community living was a beautiful thing. But over time, this community living has turned into enmeshment to where there's no respect of each other's boundaries. And there's a lot of judgment that gets thrown around for this family member doing things her way and this family member making this decision. And there's also this expectation of being able to have access to the daughter and her adult life. So the expectation that you still need to check in with your parents because you're not married, or that your family needs to have a key to your house so they can come and show up when they feel like it. The expectation that they should be going with you on all your vacations. They want to know what you make, what you have in the bank, you know, they want to have a say on how you raise your children, or who you marry and how, and what religion you practice. So all of this are forms of maternal narcissism that comes out as normalized manipulation, right? There's the lack of boundaries. There's a lack of autonomy that tends to affect your adulthood because of this expectation that you need to divulge a lot about yourself, or unlimit everyone's access to you and your time and your resources. And I find this even stronger for the adult Latina daughter. So if you're the adult Latina daughter in your family dynamic, this could really land for you. So let's talk about how this shows up for Indigenous Latinas in adulthood. And so if you've done your 23andMe, or you've gone to Somos Ancestria to have your Indigenous pathway opened up, that's a great way to kind of figure out who you are, you know, who you're not just a Latina, you actually do have a blood quantum that connects you to certain tribes. And so being that I'm from, you know, Mexican Ecuadorian descent, when I had my Somos Ancestria report sent back to me, I found out that on my maternal side in Ecuador, that's the Andean mountains and connected to the Inca civilization, right? And on my paternal side, my paternal family is from different places in Jalisco, Michoacan, Zacatecas, and a lot of my indigenous roots from my paternal side took me back to like Otomi, Nahuatl, Tarahumara, Amazonian, Huichol people. And so this is a great way to kind of unpack who you are and your generations of heritage that lie within you. So we're going to talk about how this shows up, these issues show up for you in your adult life here in the United States today, because a lot of the ways that we were taught to stay small or not talk about things or not have difficult conversations create problems for us in our adult lives. So we find it challenging to, number one, speak up and take space. So be able to speak up in a way that we know will get our point across, and where we will be heard, right? A lot of us, we keep it in, or don't say anything, or we keep it in, and then we finally blow up after we can't keep it in anymore. And so we struggle between those two extremes at times. And so being able to speak up and take up space, like raise your hand, ask for the promotion, buy the house, like decide, or even just to decide to say no to things, like I'm going to put my space in this area of life and the things I actually enjoy, not what I'm being told to do. So that's one of the areas. The negotiation for more. So whether you need to have a raise through your career or you increase your pricing on your services or product via your business, negotiate for higher speakers fee, negotiate for higher costs for your events that you host. All of these things are things that we tend to find obstacles with because the programming of colonialism, of Marianismo, tells us like no seas egoísta, no cobras, like money is wrong, just be grateful for whatever people can pay you and just be thankful. And how it seems that negotiating for more or negotiating for your worth and the value that you bring is somehow shameful and that we should just take what we can get. So that's another area that it shows up. The third one is trust oneself in developing real, authentic relationships. A lot of us who struggle to have difficult conversations because we were shamed of that, or we were punished for wanting to have those dialogues or chastised for wanting to have those conversations as adults or even as children, we find it hard to enter real, authentic, developing relationships with trust and authenticity because we don't know what it's like to have the difficult conversation. We feel if something's going wrong with the relationship, it's something we've done. We need to work harder. We need to do more. We need to be more patient. We need to not talk so much. Stop being so difficult. It's like this internalized, I've done something wrong. And so I need to fix myself instead of being able to say, hey, this is what I need in this relationship, or here's what I want going forward. In order for me to feel like this is an equal partnership, we need to be clear on this thing and be able to speak openly and directly about your needs and about what's bothering you without fear of, being abandoned emotionally by doing so. The fourth one is learning how to manage conflict. Depending, if you could think back to your family dynamic on how they managed conflict, it could really impact how you manage conflict today, or you don't. Maybe you avoid conflict because you've seen how bringing up something up turns into a fight, turns into an argument. There's screaming, there's yelling, there's cursing, there's insults back and forth. And depending on how that flowed through your family, it could make you feel like, what, if there's an issue, I'm just not going to say anything. I just don't want that kind of a problem. And that really hurts us in our adult lives because we need to be able to speak up and say when something's not right, say when we're concerned about something, be clear and open and honest about what we're feeling and what we need, and be able to risk upsetting someone in order to be authentic and honest about our needs and authentic and honest about what we are willing to do and not do. And so being able to manage that conflict, learning how to manage conflict in the way that we were raised may have put us in a difficult situation now as adults where we have to learn that. Another thing we have to learn is how to manage anxiety and depression. If our parents managed their anxiety and depression in certain ways, we might have picked up on it: cleaning, gossiping, shopping, drinking, whatever it is that they needed to do to distract themselves. This is a form of regulating their nervous system. And so we might have picked up on some of those things. But also you can even think back to when you were a little girl and you were feeling anxious, depressed, and your little self, where did you go? How did you manage that? And depending on how you handled those situations, could be how you manage your anxiety and depression today. For example, when I was a child, I handled my anxiety and depression by isolating. I would isolate myself because I didn't feel safe sharing what I was going through. I didn't feel that anyone really cared or that anybody had the time to give to me to help me process my anxiety and depression, because it seemed like everyone in my family just had such bigger problems that my little girl problems were insignificant. And so I learned to isolate. So whenever I do find myself feeling anxious or depressed, I even see it now in my adult life that I isolate and I do what I got to do to take care of myself, and kind of manage my emotions and work through it. So this is just one of the ways that we have to learn to manage that, where before I might isolate and self-deprecate or self-harm. Now I don't self-harm. I try to breathe, meditate, yoga, take a nap, give myself an herbal bath or something to kind of help myself move through that. And finally, develop autonomy and identity as an adult. This can be very hard for you as an adult if your parents are still holding on to a control over you, and through narcissism or manipulation tactics. But this feeling of like you're not allowed to be your own person and go do what you want to do with your life and your time and your resources because we're still your parents. And so that really makes it difficult for you in this adult life where everything around you is telling you you're an adult. You have a license. You're probably old enough to drink and drive. Don't drink and drive, but you're old enough to drive, and you're old enough to drink. You're old enough to join the military. You're old enough to get a job. You're old enough to buy a house. Like everything around you, you have degrees possibly, or certificates of some sort. They all tell you that you are an adult. But if you're still made to feel like a child with your parents, among your parents or in your family dynamic, then it can be really hard for you to develop that autonomy and an identity apart from being their daughter, to know who you are as a woman today. And this is why the next generation of Latina hijas are doing the healing work. More and more hijas are coming to the forefront to heal via the following methods. So we have way more Latinas going to therapy and seeking counseling. I'm so grateful to see so many Latina, Black, Indigenous women of color, therapists and counselors showing up for our community and being able to understand the Latina perspective and what it is that we're healing from, because they understand our culture and they understand the homes that we were raised in and some of the expectations placed on us. There's a lot more self-help books and courses available for women to take and continue to grow and learn from. There's things like inner child healing work that we do to kind of go back and reclaim our inner child and bring her to the forefront and sort of self-parent, self-mother, remothering ourselves from that reclaiming of our inner child. Shadow work, being able to do this kind of shadow parts work is to kind of go back and really spend time with all your parts, right? We're very complex people, and part of the complexity is not being able to accept all of our parts. We only seem to accept the one that looks socially acceptable because that's what we were taught, to be thin, to be pretty, to be quiet, to be well put together, polished, not stressed, smiling, willing to help, all of those ways are okay. But the shadow part of us, so our petty side, the side of us that doesn't want to help, the side of us that just wants to say no and not have a reason to say no, the side of us who can be competitive or envious, these are real parts of who we are. And so I particularly enjoy doing shadow work with my clients so that we can learn those parts of ourselves and integrate them and make them acceptable because they all serve a purpose. They're doing a lot of divine feminine awakening. So what does that look like? That means like connecting more to your intuition, reclaiming your own power and divinity as a sacred daughter of the elements. Like you're a part of this universe that we're in. You're a child of God. And with that comes a lot of great divinity and understanding who you are as a person and why you're such a gift and what you're here to do. And accepting yourself fully, just as you are, at the height that you are, at the weight that you are, with the burden of pain that you carry, and learning to accept that as being enough instead of having to constantly pursue the approval or expectations or projections of others. There's also a lot of work in reclaiming your indigenous roots and ancestral medicine. This is where I come in as a medicine woman. I do a lot of limpias, I do soul retrievals, but I also do personal spiritual mentorship and coaching with my clients so that they can not only learn how to heal themselves, but also turn to their own personal gifts that we all have, but their gifts and how they can use it to help themselves and help those around them. And finally, the embodiment of duality. This is so huge because it wasn't something that was taught to us and we've had to learn as adults. Duality means being able to have two truths, even if they're opposing, and let them be acceptable, right? It's like an example of duality. I love my parents deeply and I appreciate everything they've done for me. But I also can say that part of the ways that I was raised was toxic. That's duality. I understand that my parents did their very, very best. And I also acknowledge that their very, very best was still traumatic and caused me harm. So this is duality, and not being able to live in that has been a break. It's been something that has hindered us because it forced us to have a choice. That's where a lot of the things we talked about before, like being able to talk openly about diet, about your past, about the things that you questioned, the things that hurt you, because our parents didn't live in duality, didn't understand the concept of duality. They're assuming you brought this up, which means you hate me and I'm a terrible parent. And so if they understood duality, they would understand, like, it doesn't mean that my child hates me or my child disapproves of me. My child just had a traumatic experience while I was raising her, and she wants to talk it through. And so that's okay. Like, it's okay to say, I did my very, very best. And I acknowledge that in my very, very best, I might have failed you in these areas. And it doesn't change the fact that I love you. It was a misstep on my part. So not being able to embody that duality tends to carry some implications and even add further to why Latinx families tend to struggle to talk about vulnerability, generational trauma, mental health. So I want to invite you to my community, because if you think you're alone, if you think that you're the only one dealing with this and you have no place to go, one of the reasons I created Healed Hijas is because on my own mother wound healing journey, I didn't have a Latina therapist. There was no Latina authors that were writing books at the time. And so many of the people that I worked with or sought help from were outside of my culture, outside of my heritage. And there were parts of my path that I needed help with that they just simply couldn't understand from their, limited point of view. And so that's why I created Healed Hijas, so that there is a place where you can go and share your experiences and support other women and not feel shamed by like a tia or an abuela when you have a tough memory or you have a tough situation come up. We're not going to tell you things like, pues nomás tienes una madre, no seas mal hija, no seas mal agradecida. None of that. We understand that we can live in duality and we can have these conversations. So I invite you to our community of Healed Hijas. All you need to do is visit and follow. So you can visit my website, www.michellemgomez.com. And while you're there, there's a ton of cool information for you to check out, but I invite you to get a download of my free ebook. It's called The Latina Mother Wound, A Journey to Healing Your Inner Hija. It's got some great concepts for you to get started on your healing journey. I also invite you to follow me on my social media platforms. Here I am at IG at MG Warrior Woman. On Facebook, I'm MG Latina Life Coach. And on TikTok, I'm also MG Warrior Woman. So please go follow and keep up with all of our content, share, interact with. And if there's anyone else in your community, your sisters, your friends, coworkers, definitely who struggling with their inner feminine wounds, their relationship to their mother, and in the inability to be respected as a mujer madura, then this is an opportunity for them to connect to others and find healing. So thank you once again for having me. It's truly an honor to spend time with you and be able to share what I have seen so far through my work in the collective of Latinas. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now. Thank you.